Well, here we are again. Going to be looking at rocks and stones again as our theme. And this morning, continuing with the wall. Remember last time we looked at Proverbs chapter 24 and we saw the lazy man with the vineyard that was all overgrown and the walls were broken down. And we considered that. But today we're going to move on to a different wall. And because when we read the Bible, there's actually lots of things that happen next to or on a wall. And I'm sure you can think of quite a few, but just to run through a few of them, I'm sure you can, I've already said that. Let's remember that Balaam's foot was crushed into a wall by the donkey when it saw the angel. Also, Saul threw a spear at David and tried to pin him against a wall. Belshazzar the king saw the writing on the wall. Rahab's house happened to be on a wall. Paul was also lowered down at night in a large basket through an opening in the wall. Hezekiah also was sad because he was told he was going to die. And he turned his face to the wall and prayed. Ahab also did the same. Ahab didn't pray. But when Naboth wouldn't give him the vineyard, Ahab went home. He was depressed. He was sad. He was angry. And he lay down on his bed facing the wall and would not eat. Many gory events actually happened around the walls. We remember when Jezebel put on her eyeshadow, did her hair up, and she stood at a window overlooking looking at a window up high. And she was thrown from that window down to the ground, and her blood splattered on the walls and on the horses, the Bible tells us. Sheba's head also was thrown over the wall to Joab, the king of Moab, that took his oldest son who was to succeed him. He was so desperate to win the battle, he sacrificed his own son on the wall to their God. Also, after a battle with Israel, the Syrian survivors fled into the city of Aphek, where the city walls fell on 27,000 of them. Many cities were fortified with high walls like Jerusalem. Many walls fell down, a little bit like the walls of Jericho, where Israel marched around the city walls. How many times? 13 times in the 7 days. And when the priest blew the trumpet, all the people gave a shout, and the city walls collapsed. And we also can't forget the great and high walls of the city of God in Revelation chapter 21. And these were just not any old stones, they were stones made of jasper. So there's plenty of walls mentioned, isn't there? But another exciting event that happened at a wall was that of Nehemiah, and the people's enthusiasm of arising and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem around 445 BC. Even with so much opposition and heartache in getting the work done, they still got it done in 52 days. Nehemiah's name means comfort of Yah, or God of comfort. He's also said to be the shortest man that ever existed because his name is Nehemiah. We may think who our favourite person is in the Bible other than Jesus. And we may think of Joseph, we may think of Abraham, also David and others. Maybe we think of Sarah, maybe one of our favourite people, or Esther or Ruth. And in the New Testament, we may think of ones like Paul or Mary, the mother of Jesus. But very rarely people have their favourite person as Nehemiah. John actually told me the other day that one of his favourite people and the characters in the Bible is Nehemiah, so that was good to hear. But generally he misses out, even though there's so much spoken about him in this book. He did amazing work in not just building the walls of Jerusalem, but also bringing the people together with Ezra and the Levites. He was able to bring them back to the Lord to acknowledge their sins and to desire to hear the word of the Lord again and worship him. And what we will see is that Nehemiah had a heart for the people. He encouraged them and he made better living conditions for them, better working conditions for them. And this all relates to us because we are also building in our own lives. We're all trying to move forward in the Lord. And throughout our lives, we face challenges. Life's not easy, is it? Life is a battle. But it's one that God can help us through if we let him. He can give us strength like he did for Nehemiah. And it's good to remember that God chooses the opposition to get us to the destination. The enemy didn't go away in Nehemiah's case. It was there all the way through. And Nehemiah had a big enough job without the opposition. The walls and gates of Jerusalem had been in ruins for many years after the Babylonian invasion. But without rebuilding the walls of the city, it lacked protection and was exposed to the enemy. They were easy prey while their walls were broken down. And though the job was going to be hard, running into many problems, Nehemiah accepted the call to arise and build. And the amazing thing was that he lived in Persia, 1,600 kilometres away, serving the king as a cupbearer. He probably hadn't even been to Jerusalem before. Definitely hadn't seen it in its glory days. So in chapter 1, we haven't got time to go through all the details of it, but we'll work our way through what we can. And in chapter 1, Nehemiah had asked one of the brothers who had come back from Judah, how were those Jews that had returned, and also what the city of Jerusalem was like. And they said to me, the small band of Jews now living there in the land are in great trouble and shame. The walls of Jerusalem had been broken down and its doorways burned with fire. Notice the response of Nehemiah of that report. He wept with tears. He mourned. He fasted certain days. And he prayed before the God of heaven. Who would care so much about a city so far away? It's a broken down city. Why bother about that one? Just go and live in another one that's already got its walls built. Why bother with the old run-down city of Jerusalem? But the Jews had a great connection with that city, didn't they? With that land and their covenant relationship with their God. This was the land that God had given them and said that he would bless them in the land if they would obey him. And we know that they totally messed that one up. But here at this time of the exile, when they were not in the land, we have a nice psalm which shows us how the Jews actually had a love for their city of Jerusalem. And we know the words. Psalm 137 verses 1 to 6. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down. There we wept when we remembered where? Remembered Zion. On the willows nearby we hung up our harps. Those who captured us told us to sing. They told us to entertain them. Sing us a song, they said, about Zion. But the people said, how can we sing a song to the Lord in a foreign land? May I never be able to play the harp again if I forget you, Jerusalem. May I never be able to sing again if I do not remember you, if I do not think of you as my greatest joy. Here they are, captive in a foreign land, but their hearts and minds are back in Jerusalem, the holy city. In fact, the city of Jerusalem was to be their greatest joy. They were saying, how can we praise God when everything is in such a mess? Where the walls are broken down and the people are in great trouble. You know, has this ever happened to us where we've come to church? Not saying church is a foreign land, but coming to church and things are not good with us. We're not having a good time. And we come in and we see other people praising God, but we don't feel like praising God. We have to remember that God is just not the God of the mountain, he's also the God of the valley. In Romans 8 verse 28, and Barry referred to this last week, was that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. You know, it may be a mess now, things may not be right, but things will work out for good in the end. The other thing is that it's not about us. It's about how great our God is, both in the good times and in the bad times. It's how worthy he is to be praised, regardless of what is happening with us in our lives. Before facing the king, Nehemiah prayed. He was a man of prayer. He prays with a humble spirit. And in fact, just in the book of Nehemiah, well, only in the book of Nehemiah, we have him praying around 14 times. He prayed before going to the king, and again when approaching the king, he gave another quick prayer. One of those prayers that if we're in a tight spot, we quickly pray, help us, Lord. Be with us, Lord. And that may be all we say, but that's when we're in difficult time. It's good to give those quick prayers occasionally, because in Nehemiah's case, he knew that God had to be with him for this to be successful, for him to go to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah was like that. He knew that God was with him in what he was doing. And so, just going back to the first prayer, we now see him praying for success, that the king will allow him to go to Jerusalem. And we have the words there in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11. Lord, please pay attention to my prayer and to the prayers of all your other servants who want to worship your name. Please give me success today and make this man, King Artaxerxes, show me compassion. Nehemiah had already set in his heart to go to Jerusalem for the last 4 months, but somehow he had to convince the king to let him go without being killed himself. But as I've already said, he knew that God would be with him. And the thing was that Artaxerxes had stopped the walls from being built a few years earlier, back in the book of Ezra, chapter 4. So why would he allow him for the walls to be rebuilt now and finished off? Obviously, this was of God. God was opening a way for Nehemiah to be successful in protecting Jerusalem and in making it a place of worship again. And we don't know much about the journey to Jerusalem, but here we now find Nehemiah had made his way to Jerusalem with the king's letters and a royal army. And then we're told in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12, during the night I went out with a few men without telling anyone what my God had inspired me to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I had was the one that I was riding on, and it was very possibly a donkey, not a horse. But and before talking to others, he wanted to assess the situation. The broken down walls and the gates burnt with fire were in such a mess it took quite a while to get through, because sometimes the animal was not able to fit between the broken down stones. And we sometimes have to do the same in our lives. We sometimes have to assess whether there needs repairing or restoring or some rebuilding our parts of our lives so that we can have a better relationship with God and our brothers and sisters. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17, then I said to the Jews, the rulers, nobles, and priests, you see the bad situation that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let's build up the walls of Jerusalem that we won't be disgraced. I told them of the hand of my God, which was good to me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. And they said, let's rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And can we imagine how thrilled Nehemiah would have been at this time, seeing the people agreeing and doing the Lord's work? He truly would have known that God was with him and that he was in the place that the Lord wanted him to be. And then we're told in verse 19, but when Sanballat the Hornite, Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and also Geshem the Arabian heard it, they ridiculed us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? They were angry and conspired to fight against Nehemiah and his fellow workers. Then I answered them and said, the God of heaven will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will rise up and build. But you have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. What a great answer for Nehemiah as he continues to step out in faith, trusting that the Lord would be with him. As the opposition got greater and the work began to slow down because of the fear of the people, we're told in verse 14 of chapter 4, I looked and I rose up and said to the nobles, to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And when our enemies heard that it was known to us and God had brought their counsel to nothing, all of us returned to the wall, every one to his work. And from that time forth, half of my servants did the work and half of them held their spears, the shields, the bows, the coats of mail, and the rulers were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built the wall and those who bore burdens loaded themselves. Every one with one of his hands did the work, and with the other held his weapon. Nehemiah tried not to allow the opposition to distract him. Instead, he focused on the job ahead. He organised his resources and manpower and moved forward rebuilding the city. For we're told in chapter 4, verse 6, that the people had a mind to work. Despite the opposition, they were willing to get in and do the job. But as the walls of the city began to rise, their opposition intensified. Nehemiah's enemies threatened, they conspired, they ridiculed. But in spite of the danger and the ever-present threat of invasion, the work progressed. It was a time of stress for every builder, so they had their swords girded by their side, and so they built. And as the work continued, Nehemiah's enemies became more desperate. 4 times they asked him to leave the safety of the city and meet with them under the pretense of resolving the conflict. But Nehemiah knew that they were determined to harm him. And so each time they approached him, he responded with the same answer: I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Then they also sent him a letter saying that he was going to revolt against the king and become king himself. They tried to get him into trouble, but that wasn't true. And finally they tried to lure him into the house of the Lord, where he would sin, and so that they would have an evil report against him. Nehemiah wouldn't have anything to do with that. He said, I'm not one that runs and hides. The Lord had made him strong, so he was prepared to fight against the opposition. And so looking back at Nehemiah chapter 3, we have an account of each person or groups of people who worked on the walls. Some men were assigned to a section that was close to their home, and some came from far away. Some were priests and sons of priests. Some of the men's normal jobs were specialised, such as perfumers and goldsmiths, while some were nobles. Regardless of who they were, where they came from, or what walk of life they represented, all the people had something in common. When Nehemiah put out the call for help, they answered. Each worked on their appointed section of the walls and gates. And can we imagine the scale of undertaking, especially when we remember that the men working didn't have the new technology that we have today. They were working with hand tools, and it was quite a daunting task. In this chapter 3, we're told that we're shown that there's 42 groups mentioned who rebuilt the walls. Some are no more than a mention, others are described in detail as to what they did to rebuild the wall. They were a people that were divided up into groups to do the work. They helped each other and they worked diligently. Every one of these people began at home with their own private responsibilities. Each one of these could have found an excuse for not to take on their own part of the wall, but they didn't. There was plenty of excuses they could use or could have used. They could have said, It's not my kind of work. I have never built a wall before. You know, the first one mentioned, Elisha, the high priest. A priest works with his mind, not with his body. He would normally be looking after the spiritual needs of the people. But he rolled up his sleeves and hauled bricks around with the rest of them. Hananiah was a perfume maker. You know, what does Max Factor got to do with carpentry? Yet that did not stop this man from building not just one section, but two sections of the wall. Also the goldsmiths and the merchants, they were specialists. They could have said, I'm too busy with my own business. But they put down their money counters, their little hammers, and took up the trowel and the brick buckets. The only negative comment in this chapter was towards the noblemen of Tekoa. They were too proud to work under the contractors. But the men of Tekoa worked anyway, even without their leaders. And when their leaders failed, they kept on going. In fact, just like the perfumers, they built two sections. The woman also could have said, it's men's work. We don't do that sort of stuff. But they didn't let their gender get in their way. Notice the daughters of Shallum. Shallum had no sons, so his daughters pitched in and did the work. These girls tramped through the dust and lifted rocks like men did, and like the men, they laboured hard for the work of God. There were also those that lived outside of Jerusalem. They could have said, I won't help. This isn't my city. What's this got to do with me? Yet they worked as hard as they could, like anyone else. Some of the younger ones also could have said, I'm too young. Hanan, the sixth son of Zalaph, took his own section of the wall. I don't know where the other older five brothers were. We don't know. But their little brother was out there doing his bit in building the wall. And so, as I said at the start, the amazing thing was that the rebuilding of these walls around Jerusalem was finished in 52 days. This was an incredible feat, both in being able to do it in such a quick time and also being able to do it while armed and having to protect themselves from the enemy. You know, some people question the possibility of them being able to do the task in such a short period. However, they forget that the Lord was with them, and also the Israelites pushed themselves into the work wholeheartedly, and this also included those from around the region. Upon completion of the restoration of the temple through Ezra, and also now the walls being built through Nehemiah, we now read in chapter 8 of the restoration and renewal of God's people. But just because the construction project of Jerusalem was successful in rebuilding, there was now a need of spiritual renewal of the hearts of God's people. And this was done by the reading and hearing of God's word. And the focus was just not having to read it to the people, but the people were to understand it. And this is what happened. We're told in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 3, there in the square by the gate, he read the law to them from dawn until noon, and they all listened attentively. They listened closely so that they all understood what was being read to them. And the thing was that Nehemiah had rebuilt the walls. But we have to remember that the restoration of Jerusalem was not the end of the story. You see, a reconstructed city will not bring God's people into a right relationship with God. It's like what Luke chapter 9 verse 25 tells us, where it says, "For what profit is it if a man gains the whole world and is himself destroyed or lost?" Just the building of the walls was not good enough. It wasn't going to do the trick. The people also needed to be transformed. They needed to have a hunger to hear and know God's word. They needed to repent and be rebuilt, restored, and return to God. And that's what they did for a time. And if you want to see any more about the Nehemiah, come to the movie tonight and you can see the rest of the story, because I haven't got time to do that this morning. But in our lives, we also are to be built and repaired. The Bible tells us that the purpose of the church is for the equipping of the saints. And the idea behind equipping is to prepare, to strengthen, and to make something able to be used. We come together this morning to strengthen one another, to make us strong, to make us to be able to live for Jesus and serve him when we leave this place. When it comes to setting up the spiritual rules and standards like the builders, we probably could come up with all sorts of reasons or excuses for not praying, for not reading our Bibles, not helping in the church, not giving, not witnessing, or building bridges of forgiveness. We could come up with all sorts of excuses. Like the people, just as the people had a portion of wall to build, so have we a part of God's service, or the service of the Lord, to keep this church running for many years to come. We don't want this church to die off within the next year or two. We want the church to carry on, don't we? And to do that, we need each other. We need all of us to work like the builders did of Jerusalem. And so as a church or a body, we need to be prepared to unite, to focus, and continue building the spiritual walls, and which are far more important than the physical walls. We need each other to build. And at the end, may we all be able to say, as Nehemiah said in his prayer, "Remember me, O my God, for good."